Well, today we welcome our two guest speakers, Elizabeth and Luther Leith. Elizabeth obtained her master's degree in archaeology at the University of Oklahoma. She then managed the department's 5 million item collection and developed a computer database to replace handwritten note cards, while Luther obtained his doctoral degree in archaeology. Elizabeth is currently the senior academic curator in the Anthropology department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2016, she helped the Fitchburg Historical Society in obtaining a grant to develop a computer database for the Fitchburg Historical Society and provided several of her students the opportunity to fulfill their volunteer requirements by helping to digitize thousands of Fitchburg Historical Society photographs and documents. These digitized images and documents provided the basis for our current Fitchburg Historical Society website, which, by the way, we would love to have all of you check out. There's so much available on that website, fitchburghistory.org. Luther is currently an archaeological principal investigator and field coordinator at the Museum Archaeology Program of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Luther obtained his master's and PhD from the University of Oklahoma and has been practicing cultural resource management in Wisconsin since 2012. He's worked on sites ranging from over 12,000 years ago to the 20th century. So please join me in welcoming the Leiths and their program, Deep History of the Fitchburg Area, 10,000 Years of Occupation.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, we got a good crowd today.
Yeah.
So when we were asked to talk today, it was about to give a general presentation about the long history of Wisconsin and Fitchburg specifically, and to try to focus a little bit on Fitchburg itself. So we're going to have to back up a little bit and give you some general information, and then we can dive into Fitchburg itself. So just to give you an idea of some of the things that we'll talk about today, we want to talk about first, what is deep history? What does that mean? What does archaeology mean? Give you some idea of some of the cultural resources that we've identified that you might be interested about in the Fitchburg and surrounding area. And then we can go a little bit more into depth about that 10,000 plus years of history that we know about in this area. So history, the word history, stereotypically has been linked to writing. So usually when we talk about historic times or history, we talk about a written record that is associated with it. But we have to keep in mind that there are a lot of oral traditions as well. So a lot of cultures will transcribe information orally rather than written. And so if we talk about history in the sense of some kind of record, whether it's oral or written, we can expand that history back further in time. So the word history has a lot of connotations involved with it. We will sometimes use different words as we're talking through our presentation, and we'll tell you what those definitions are as we come to them. Archaeology itself explores tens to hundreds of thousands of years of history, because as I tell you about what archaeology is, you'll understand there's a lot that goes into this discipline. And archaeology then is the things that we study can then sometimes corroborate and can sometimes refute some of the history that we know about. So we can talk about some of that. In order to talk about archaeology, you first really need to understand how it fits into its parent discipline, anthropology. In the Americas, archaeology is one of the 4 subfields of the anthropology discipline. The others are ethnography or cultural anthropology, bioanthropology or physical anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. Together, all of these provide a holistic study of humanity in all places and times. I need to move my marker over here because I need to scroll down to my notes. And typically we can compartmentalize where specific research questions lie based on some very general guidelines. I'll start with easy ones here. Linguistic anthropologists study languages, how they developed and evolved over time, and how they're used broadly in communication. Physical anthropologists study the human body and the emergence of humanity. How did we become human, and when did that happen? How does our body compare or contrast with other living creatures on the planet? Now, the last two have simple definitions, but for some reason, for me, they sometimes are hard for me to convey. Cultural anthropologists study cultures and everything about them, their sense of community, social patterns, art and creativity, economics, and so on. The focus is not just on the outside person looking in, but also about global interaction. Most often, this means studying living people because these topics are hard to extrapolate from the past. Archaeologists study the material culture that were left behind by people. What strategies for living have been used over time? How did technological advances start? And how have people used and interacted with the environment and other people around them? Each of these subdisciplines developed on its own, usually as a topic of interest within another discipline. So the evolution of the discipline of anthropology as a whole is harder to understand because its separate parts developed at different rates through time. While the idea of what anthropology is has been around since at least the late 1500s, it wasn't recognized as its own unique academic discipline in the Western Europe and the Americas until the late 1800s. The last 120 years have been an incredible amount of growth for this discipline of the awareness of how people see this idea of studying people. So while we still recognize 4 specific subfields within anthropology, we now understand that there are thousands of possibilities that anthropologists can take. Because when we step back to our basic definition of anthropology, it's all about people. And with that basic tenet, the possibilities are endless. We can take this in so many different directions. Medicine, the environment, adaptation, religion, history, art, you name it. If you can study it in the context of people, then you can link it to anthropology. And this is why anthropologists often identify on a variety of levels. While we see ourselves as an anthropologist, we also may define ourselves as a biologist or a sociologist or a doctor or a geologist, because that helps to define our interest within that broad context of anthropology. Now, like anthropology, archaeology has its own issues. The biggest is that archaeology has had a difficult time finding where it best fits in relation to other disciplines. While we generally fall into the humanities because of our link to people, archaeologists can focus on some pretty specific things that can shove us into chemistry, medicine, and pretty much any other academic category you can think of. Through time, archaeology has most often been placed with either the classics or natural history. Obviously, 2 disciplines that don't really fit well together on their own. So it can make it really hard for people to understand where archaeology fits in. While we do share some similarities with paleontology, like the kinds of excavation methods that we use, and while we continue to see movies that place people alongside dinosaurs, the fact remains that archaeology is not paleontology. We can collaborate on projects with and learn a lot about other disciplines within natural history, like plants and animals and geology, but adding that people aspect to our research sets us apart from these other disciplines. Likewise, classically popular movies have provided a stereotypical perception of archaeologists and the discipline. It's true that a lot of early archaeological work was performed in famous places like Egypt and the Mediterranean, but there's a lot more to archaeology than learning about just those specific areas and time periods. And please, while Indiana Jones was an archaeologist, his methods and ethics were definitely reflective of that early period of the discipline. Remember, those movies were set in the 1930s and the 1940s. While I do know many archaeologists who own a fedora and a bullwhip, I have yet to see one who actually uses them in practice. Because we are archaeologists and that subfield fits well with our topic today, let's look a little bit more closely at the archaeology subdiscipline. Like I said before, archaeology is the study of material culture over the course of time. When I say the word material culture, I mean all of the stuff that people leave behind. And I don't mean just in the finite sense. When you walk to a park for a picnic, you may accidentally litter when you leave. If a barn in the countryside falls down, the farmer may decide to fill the area in instead of rebuild. These are all material culture, and it's sometimes someone in the future who comes to that same park or that same farm can learn stuff about you based on that material that you left behind. Material culture can show us about activities and behaviors, technology and social interactions, and much, much more, from development of the earliest tools in Olduvai Gorge by the earliest humans in Africa through material we use every day today. And let me tell you, people have left a lot of stuff behind over the centuries. And looking through this vast array of material culture, we can recognize the flexibility that is humanity and how humans have adapted to changes, both environmental and cultural, over time. It provides a long, deep view that can span back hundreds of thousands of years. It allows us to see what it means to be human through the choices we've made and what we have placed importance on what ideas or techniques we choose to develop further or let die away. In order to interpret material culture and formulate a scientific conclusion about it, we have to address all of the variables associated with it. That's why archaeologists are the Renaissance men of anthropology. Because just looking at stuff doesn't fully answer the questions archaeologists ask. Humans are unique, and as we all know, we don't always make logical or efficient decisions. In fact, people can do a lot of things that make us scratch our heads. And I'm talking here about things we do and when we talk to people today. Why did you do that? And that is a common question that cultural anthropologists do actually ask. We need to understand how the landscape changed over time to understand what the material culture means. That includes understanding how to identify soils and soil formation, how to identify animals so we know what animals were living alongside people, and rocks to know what how the landscape formed and what raw materials were available in different areas. We need to learn how to make pots and textiles and lithic tools to understand not just that final product, but the resources needed to make it. We need an understanding of chemistry and physics, biology and medicine to form a big picture of the material culture we find. We become computer analysts, artists, chemists, and more in our pursuit of our interest in people. So what do archaeologists do? Chances are the most you're going to see are some people standing on the side of the road digging holes, because we conduct excavations and research looking at that stuff that people leave behind. As a scientific discipline, we rely on the scientific method, which is why the public face of archaeology tends to look like various shaped holes in the ground that we find our material culture in. And I'm going to pass it on to you.
Okay. We can go back one slide.
Oh, okay.
So I'm probably going to move around more than Liz did, and if you guys have questions along the way, feel free to ask. But this is just a real quick summary of what we got going on these photos. So on the very far photo on that side, that's us doing initial survey work. We're just trying to find out, are there sites present? That's up across the Merrimack Ferry up in Columbia County. And then when we find sites, we have to determine if they're eligible for National Register of Historic Places. We'll talk a little bit about why in a second. So you can see here's a historic site on the lower right for you guys. You guys can see this deposit here. So we've got our nice square hole in the ground, and you guys can see there's something seriously going on there that you don't see in your garden or anything else. And then that's some young archaeologist from, I don't know, I'll say 20-something years ago. But I thought it'd be kind of fun to show us in there. And Liz and I are in Iowa working on the 151 expansion that they did 20 or so years ago. That's a historic site.
Is that the post office?
I think it's a cellar from a cabin from like the 1820s, something like that. It was really early cabin. So it was kind of interesting. So why do we do archaeology? We can do, if you're in academia, you can do it as research. So we've got a lot of archaeologists over, throughout the UW systems, and, they cover anything. We've got archaeologists that work in the Indus Valley. We got archaeologists that work in Mesoamerica. We got archaeologists that work in North America. They develop a research design, go out, try to answer questions that they've came up with. Myself, I've been doing cultural resource management for over 20 years, over 10 years in Wisconsin. So my responsibility is legal compliance. So the state and federal regulations that have to be complied with depending on circumstances. So if you're getting federal dollars for your project, if you had to get a grant or it's part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill or something, you would fall under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So what the Section 106 says is you have to take into consideration the impacts of your project, if it's getting federal dollars or federal permitting or it's on federal land, if it's somehow tied to the federal government, and that's for sites that are known and currently recorded, and that's for areas that haven't had a survey, and there may be sites there that haven't been recorded. So that's the federal level. There's also Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. Liz deals with this more than I do. This is more of a museum side of things. It's the Native groups in North America were like, you've had our ancestors sitting on shelves and boxes for decades and centuries, and you haven't done anything. We want our ancestors back. We want to put them back in the ground where they belong. So you guys could imagine if somebody went through a cemetery here in Fitchburg and dug up a bunch of your relatives and put them on a shelf for a couple hundred years in a museum, you'd probably be upset too. So in 1990, they were able to get legislation passed that says the museums have to take into account what's in their collections, and if it's human remains or associated funerary objects, stuff that was buried with the people, it has to go back to the tribes, and the tribes rebury it. So at the state level, we have Wisconsin statutes 4440 and 15770. 4440 is similar to Section 106. It's like Section 106 light at the state level. So if you're getting state money or state permitting, if you're building, the library, you have to have a water discharge permit from DNR. Your project would fall under 44. So in Section 44, you have to take into account the impacts of your project on sites that are already listed. So you don't have to survey a bunch of area that doesn't have sites. You just have to take into consideration where the sites are. State Statute 15770 is Wisconsin burial law. We are one of the few states that have a burial law, and we're one of the first states that have a burial law. This protects all burials. It protects burials in modern European cemeteries. It protects burials out in Native American mounds. It protects unmarked burials that, where your parents died and you buried them on the back 40. If they're a burial, they're protected under 157. So if you're doing a project or you want to put a pool in your backyard and you happen to have a burial site mapped within your property, you would have to do some coordination with the Historic Preservation Office. So the intent of all these laws are to protect our finite cultural resources. Once an archaeological site is excavated, if it's bulldozed for part of a road or somebody goes out and does research on it, it's gone. It's never going to be there again. Once you pull that material out of the ground, it's never going to be in those same associations that it was when it was originally developed. So as professional archaeologists, we go out there and we try to systematically destroy the site. We try to keep really good notes, photographs, levels, depths, where everything is located. We've got some really fantastic technology now where we can 3D model where everything is. So after the excavation's done, you can come back and you can look and spin it all around and see where everything was from. Oh, wrong button. So I did just a quick look on the Wisconsin Historic Preservation Database that's housed at the Historical Society. And if we step back a little bit, Dane County, Wisconsin has almost 1,700 sites previously recorded. The Madison area has 272 sites. Fitchburg's got 20 sites. So I'll talk to you in just a second about why I think that's an issue. Down here, so I heard Alan talk about, you guys had somebody come in and talk about historic buildings and whether they're eligible for the National Register. These are historic buildings and standing structures that are recorded in the architectural and historic structures portion of the database. So Dane County's got over 13,000 buildings. Some of those have been destroyed. Some of those aren't eligible for the register. Some of those are listed properties on the National Register. Madison has almost 8,000. Fitchburg's got about 327 buildings. So my question is, why are there so few in Fitchburg? If we go to the next slide, I know the scale is a little bit off. So this is basically Fitchburg, the 36 square miles was Fitchburg Township. You can see these color polygons here and all those up there. Those are the archaeological sites. So there's not a lot of sites back over here previously recorded in Fitchburg. If we add the standing structures, all these dots represent a single standing structure. You can see that huge cluster up there north of the belt line. You've got a big cluster here. You got some stuff down here and over there. But I think it's really telling when you look at, these are the surveys that have happened, the cultural resource surveys. So we had a survey along, 151. You got a lot of road surveys going through. There's not a lot of archaeology over here. I don't think that's because people weren't living there. I think it's because there hasn't been adequate survey. So there could be historic farmsteads there. There could be pre-contact sites. There could be really old sites. There could be really recent sites. One thing I didn't mention about Section 106, to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, the building or site has to be over 50 years old. So that's a moving target. Every year we add additional buildings that would potentially be eligible, but every year we lose additional pre-contact and historic sites to development. So part of what I do is, if we had a road project here on the road, I would go through and do a survey and see if there's any unrecorded sites there. I mean, you got a lot of high probability areas where you've got, terraces above water, areas where you had resource-rich environments where people could hunt and fish and collect plant materials. So we talked about the deep history, and one of the things I said 10,000 plus years. So if we go back, archaeologists break up our time into units. So Paleo-Indian's the earliest period, and I'll talk a minute in why we don't have sites necessarily here older than 12,000 years. After that, we have the Archaic period. It's a shift in technology, a shift in culture, a shift in lifeway. Then we have the Woodland period. Again, is another shift in lifeway because of environmental conditions and other things. Oneota, Middle Mississippian, there are no sites in Fitchburg that correspond to Oneota. I don't know if that's necessarily bias in the data or if there's really no sites. I know Oneota is really a heavy presence over in southwest Wisconsin and southeast Wisconsin, and we just haven't had a lot of survey work in south central Wisconsin to know for sure. But Oneota corresponds to, if we talk about the United States in general, the upper Midwest in general, we had state-level societies in that time frame from about 1,000 years ago to about 350 years ago. If you guys ever travel to southern Illinois and go to East St. Louis and St. Louis, see the Arch. On the Illinois side, a huge site called Cahokia. It was a city that was larger than London at the time. It had barrios. It had people coming in from outside. They had immigrant populations from other groups that were, all they did was produce shell beads. All these guys did was produce, points and other tools. All these guys did was produce pottery. It was a really complex society. We didn't hear much about it because by the time Europeans got there, most of those populations have been decimated by the diseases that came along with Europeans. And then the last post-contact period over there, historic period, you go back about 400 years to 1600, 1650 is around the time that Europeans got to what would become Wisconsin, got to what would become Fitchburg. So I have a breakdown here. It doesn't add up to 20 sites because some of the sites have multiple components. So they'll have an earlier component and a later component. But we have 9 sites that we don't know exactly what they're related to. Most of these are pre-contact sites, so we don't know what culture. We have 3 sites that are Paleo-Indian. So you guys have 3 sites here that date back to the earliest occupation of Wisconsin. We have 1 site that has an archaic component, 6 sites that have a woodland component, 5 sites that are historic farmsteads or historic sites.
Question?
Yeah.
What does BP stand for?
I'm sorry, that's an excellent question. This is before present. So, we're in 2024, so, about 12,000 years before today. So that's what the BP is. And then the AD is, your typical Anno Domini. It's our regular dating system. But that's an excellent question. So if we get back to the earliest occupation of Wisconsin, we don't go much past 12,000 because we had glaciers here. There were several great glacial periods, actually going back several 100,000 years, but one of the most recent was about 85,000 years ago to about 9,500 years ago. And that glacier covered a lot of the continental United States. If we go here, you can see the Green Bay lobe. That glacier was all coming down from this direction. Here's Dane County. Fitchburg sits about right here. So most of this area was under a glacier. That's why we have a lot of hilly, hummocky landforms around here. Those are all, glacial landforms. It's melting ice, dropping rocks and dirt and stuff out of the ice and building moraines and drumlins and other kind of landforms. Some of the earlier glacial periods, the ice sheet extended all the way down to Oklahoma. So if you want to know what Wisconsin looked like before the last glacial period, all of Wisconsin would look like the Southwest, the coulees and the driftless area. It was an area that wasn't covered by the ice in the last ice age, so the ice didn't grind all that landform down. So at one time, that's what Wisconsin looked like all the way across. But the ice has moved a lot of stuff, ground down a lot of landforms. So if we look at glacial deposits, this is just to give you an idea. Right here is where the edge of the glacier came to. Here's Fitchburg in this area. So it was under the glacier. All of our landforms here were developed from the ice melting and receding back. If you get out, further over here by, Mazomanie, Spring Green, some of these places this way, where you start getting into all of that relief that you get in southwest Wisconsin, that's areas that hadn't been glaciated. So people couldn't be here when the glaciers were here because there was nothing to live off of. It was ice. And, some of the glaciers were several hundred feet, thousands of feet thick when you got out to the center of them. So Paleoindian, let's see. So how do we break up the groups is based on changes in the material culture that we see. So we'll have some material culture, the way that they make stuff lasts hundreds of years, thousands of years. Some things last, much shorter time periods. The things we don't know, because all we can study is the remains that are left behind, is how did these groups identify themselves? The ancestor, the Ho-Chunk claimed that they've been here since time immemorial. At the time, 10,000 years ago, we don't know if they considered themselves Ho-Chunk or what they called themselves. They were ancestors. They were their, grandparents or grandparents or grandparents or grandparents. We don't know what languages they necessarily used. Language is really mutable. It can change over time. You guys have seen, I'm sure, in your lifetimes where, words that meant one thing when you were a kid mean something different when you're an adult. New words come in. People come up with new words. All the technology, all the crazy technology has to be named something, so we come up with new words for it. So we don't know exactly what the language was used. But we do know from the tribe's oral histories, where their origin stories say that they came from. So Paleoindian, 12,000 years ago to 8,500 years ago, these are the first people into Wisconsin, first people in North America. There are sites in North America and South America that date 20,000, 30,000. There's some that are a little tenuous and not necessarily as accepted, that may go back to 60,000 years ago. It's important to understand that, 12, 18,000 years ago, there were still Neanderthal populations living in Spain. So you had what people consider cavemen still extant, still living in Europe at the time that people got to North America. The accepted route is through Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge, down through Canada, There's also a theory where they came from Asia along the coast in boats. We know that people could travel long distances in boats. People, 40 plus thousand years ago, got to Australia. They had to leave, sail out far enough in the ocean that they could no longer see the land that they left before they could see the land they were getting to. And so if we're talking about just hopping along the coast, that's not real hard to believe. It was into the Pleistocene. We had a lot different animals running around. We had mammoths, we had mastodons, we had the American lion. I had a little spot in here. I don't know if maybe it's in the notes, but the American lion was 3 times as large as the African lion. All of these animals were huge. This armadillo was the size of a Volkswagen. This is a modern bison skull from Oklahoma, so you can see how wide the horns are here. This is bison antiquus. The horn span was like this. You get bison latifrons and some of the occidentalis. The largest bison that they have remains for has a 9-foot horn span. So the argument, they were more likely not as much herd animals. They were more solitary. As it became herd animals, you need the horns not to poke your neighbor in the eye. So the horns would get smaller. The bodies got smaller. Bison antiquus was one of the major resources there. It was about 3 times larger than modern bison. The short-faced cave bear was like 12 foot tall. Arms reached like 9 feet out. They were huge. So people were here in North America. They were hunting these. They were living in small bands, probably, families or extended families. They moved around the environment. If you go on outside of Wisconsin, you go down to the southern plains, we know by the resources that they're using to make their materials, you would have some expended stuff and some brand new tools here down in around Edwards, Texas. They would move all the way up to the Panhandle. They would retool and get new stuff there. They'd go all the way out to the Ozarks. So they were following the bison around on the plains, and we know exactly where they were going because you get worn out stuff and brand new stuff from this material, and then worn out stuff and brand new stuff from that material over here, and then vice versa. So they were covering huge areas. There's 3 basic cultural breaks in there. There's Clovis, Folsom, and late Paleo-Indian. That doesn't sound super cool, but these guys were hunting megafauna. They were hunting the giant bison. They were hunting elephants. They were competing against cave bears. They were living with dire wolves. They were living with saber-toothed cats, with American lions. It was a dangerous time to be alive. So technologically, I can show you a couple of these. The earliest point, accepted point style in North America is Clovis points. I have one up here that Liz said it's supposed to be a gainy point, but you can see it's got a flute. So they would make the tool, and then they would take their hammerstone or antler and smack it here and drive a flake off here and spin it around and drive a flake off there. And then that's when they would haft it with the spear. It would go along like this. So the earliest ones were lanceolate points. This is about average size. Sometimes they get about that big. But, just imagine going at an elephant with a spear that's got a point on it that big. The next culture, Liz can click me, is Folsom. So really similar technology. We're making a lanceolate point, but this one they're knocking the flutes off through the entire body of the point on both sides. And just a testament to how good they were at their technology. You know it's a fake if it's thicker than 2 millimeters in the middle. And so again, this one, it was kind of neat because they would haft it like this. As it wore down, they would just move it out a little bit. As it wore down, they would move it out a little bit, and eventually you get ones that are little bitty nubs, and you get some that are big. So we know that, they could just, it was like, a utility knife. Some of the utility knives, when they get dull, you break it off. They get dull, you break it off and sharpen it. And then the last one is late Paleo-Indian. So it's the same basic point is this, but they decided that's a lot of work to make those flutes because you don't want to spend a lot of time to make the point, try to drive this off, break it in half, and then have to start all over. So they abandoned making the flutes, and you get kind of this lance-shaped point. So the earliest guys, Clovis, hunted elephants, hunted mammoths and mastodons. I got a tooth here. So this is mastodon tooth. Mastodon, mast-like tooth is what it translates to. They were the elephants. They lived in woodland, marshy kind of environments. Their teeth have really big, huge cusps and crowns on them to crush up branches. If you had a mammoth tooth, it would look really similar to this, but it's got a whole bunch of really fine, short cusps for eating grass. So I might as well use my prop if I got it. So Clovis points, they hunt mammoths, mastodons. Folsom, they start hunting bison, some of the big giant bison. Late Paleoindian folks, they're hunting bison and transitioning into other stuff.
What type of stone would they have used to make those in this area?
So in this area, for paleo, so it changes over time a little bit. Right. To do this technology, you need really high quality material. So there's Galena chert. It's out of the, I think it's still the Prairie du Chien Formation, but Galena chert is really high quality. There's some high quality stuff coming out of some of the tills, and then they were moving quite large distances. They could get down into Illinois and use Burlington chert. So it's basically chert, which is a material that's got a lot of silica in it. The other material that they use, it's really common for paleo stuff. If you go up to Silver Mound, up by La Crosse, in La Crosse County, Trempealeau County, there's a silicified sandstone. So it looks like they took a sugar cube and made a point out of it. It's really beautiful stuff. And it's amazing, but it's really highly silicified, so you can make a nice point out of it. So we do get Prairie du Chien chert, the native chert around here, some of this material, but it's not as common because it's not a really high quality material.
What was the population of people living here at this time?
I can't give you an exact number. It's pretty low density, so you're talking about Wisconsin. There's tens of maybe hundreds of thousands of people, but broken up into really small groups all over the environment. As we get later in time, people start settling down, and the groups get bigger, the communities get bigger. I can talk a little bit about that in a second too.
What environments are you referring to? Our entire country?
Well, across the country, these are these same cultures across the entire United States. So you can get, Clovis is named for a point found in Clovis, New Mexico. Folsom is named for a point that's found in Folsom, New Mexico. But since that time, we found Folsom points up in the La Crosse area. We found Folsom points up here in Wisconsin. We found Clovis points up here. I didn't do a deep dive, but we do have 3 Paleo-Indian sites here in Fitchburg. A couple of them are late Paleo-Indian, but a couple of them are one of the earlier Paleo-Indian groups. So as far as environment, we're talking about a cold, wet period. I'm glad you brought that up. It's cold and wet right after the glacial period, which contrasts to, if Liz hits the next slide, the Archaic period got really hot and dry. There was a 4,000-year drought on the plains during the Archaic period. So there's just not a lot of people there because, everything was dry and it was really, really harsh conditions. So to combat that shift in population, a lot of the very large animals that people used for food went extinct. People transitioned to hunting more normal, what we consider modern animals. So they were shifting from large mammals to deer. They were shifting to other resources, we have evidence here. I'm sure people in Paleo-Indian times used different kind of plants, medicinal plants and stuff. We just don't have the evidence. If you get into Archaic, you start to get that evidence.
I'm going to ask you, you had mentioned about these various groups, previous slide, of going around and encountering the various deposits.
Yeah.
Sure. Is there any evidence that early that there was some kind of trade?
It's really hard to extrapolate trade at that time. But one of the sites that I've worked on here, it was over on Highway 19, we found a cache of 40 blanks. So they took the stone and thinned it down to get ready to make a point, and then put them in the ground in anticipation of coming back. And those were galena. The technology they used to make those, how they knocked the flakes off, corresponded to paleo. And then there was a site just adjacent to it that had a paleo point. So we assume that those are between 8,000 and 12,000 years old. But people would cache stuff on the environment in anticipation of coming back around. I'm sure as groups interacted here and onto the plains, that there was probably some kind of interaction. If we look at the DNA and stuff, there's a strong suggestion that, there was incest taboos. People were, you had your small group, but you would get together in larger groups and find husbands and wives and then split back into smaller groups. So it's trade, it's tough. Archaic, when you get into the Archaic and into the woodland period, we got pretty strong evidence for trade. Like there was a carved bone implement that was found in Ohio, and it's somebody's memory of what an elk looked like when they went out onto the plains and did some trade out there. They went out there, traded for some stuff, came back and carved this thing of, so it doesn't look quite like it should have, but there's evidence there. There's evidence of trade later on from copper from Isle Royale in Michigan down. People were going all the way down to Mesoamerica and trading, getting obsidian and bringing that stuff back. But all of that kind of happened in the environments and time periods where you had more free time to be able to free people up. Paleo-Indian, they're just trying to survive. They're hunting megafauna and trying to not get eaten by megafauna. Archaic, you start to see some of those things because the prey species start to get smaller. You're not competing with large predators. So notable advances. Quick rewind. Paleo-Indian probably was the time period domestication of domesticated dog probably came across with Paleo-Indian people. They're the first domesticated animal.
You lost the word I was questioning, atlatl. There, atlatl.
So I have a picture I'll show you in a second. It's a spear thrower. I'll show you in 1 second on that. Focus on deer. Go to the next one, Liz. So the points got a little bit smaller, and I'll show you that in a second, I promise. So we go to different types. So you get notching on the sides. You get kind of a stem variety where they grind the base of the stem. You get other ones where the stem is kind of rounded. Again, that's all hafted in. So if we go to the next one, you see the picture up here of the guy with the atlatl. So you had the little handle that would come out like this, and it extends the length of your forearm, and it has a little hook on it, and it hooks into that big shaft you can see with the fletchings on it, and then you see the little shaft at the beginning. So they would have this socketed into a piece that's about that long, and that would socket into the atlatl. And so they'd take it like this, and they'd throw it. The foreshaft that's got the little point on it would stab in and stay in and cause the animal to bleed. The other part would bounce back out. They could grab that again, socket in a new one, and throw it. They've done the physics, so Liz talks about all the different aspects of archaeology. So some archaeologists got together with some physicists. They set up a big target. They were throwing the atlatls at it to see how much more force you would get with an atlatl. So the first time they did it, it went all the way through the machine and broke the machine. And then they fixed the machine, and they tried it again. It increases the force of your throw 200%. So if you just threw a spear, it would hit, if you threw it with an atlatl, it's like 200% more force. So it would pierce elephant hide. Elephant hide's pretty thick, and you'd have these points, and you'd use the atlatl to actually, again, with the atlatl, when Europeans got to Mesoamerica, and Cortez and all those guys are coming in trying to find the cities of gold, the native people in Mesoamerica, some of the groups are still using atlatls. They could pierce the European breastplates with an atlatl, with a dart, with the stone point. So it was really nice technology. It worked. It stayed for a long period of time, but it's not quite as efficient as a bow and arrow. So Liz is getting me to hurry up.
He's got a lot of slides left.
Some of them will go faster. The woodland period, this is the time when people start settling down in communities. People start farming. They start domesticating different crops. There's a huge array of crops in North America that were domesticated before corn, and then corn came in. Corn, beans, and squash eventually replaced all of the pre-corn domesticates. The only one we still have is sunflower. Sunflower was a domesticate from the woodland period. These people are living in larger communities. They're settling into towns. They're burying their ancestors. They're building mounds. Large communities. They develop bow and arrow technology around 8300. They start making pottery. This is the first time we see people taking clay and making pottery. You can use the pottery. It greatly increases the ability to cook food. You know, you can boil stuff in a pot a lot easier than digging a hole in the ground and putting hot rocks in it. We had a lot of increased ceremonialism. I talked about wide trade networks throughout the woodland period. A lot of marine shell from the Gulf Coast comes up to Wisconsin. You get materials coming from out east. You get materials coming from Mesoamerica. You get materials coming from out in the Rocky Mountains, all coming into Wisconsin, Ohio, and this Midwestern area. The next one. So again, we have a little bit different shape in the points, and then the difference is this is a spear point, probably used with an atlatl. This is an arrow point. So much smaller, much more efficient, a lot easier to make. This is another arrow point. This is really common in Wisconsin. It's a little triangular point. So you make these, less tool stone, you can make a whole lot more points. They're faster to make because they're a lot smaller. Technology is a lot less intense. And then shooting with the bow and arrow, you can shoot a lot more arrows, a lot faster than you can even with an atlatl or thrown spears. So it rapidly replaces the atlatl and the earlier technology. And then, you know, these kind of points are found all the way up until European contact. Next one, pottery. Again, people during woodland period are making pots. I got some different potsherds up here. The earlier potsherds, they would take crushed up rock or sand and mix it in the clay as a tempering agent. There's a bunch of different designs that they would put on the outside. These probably are representative identity groups. You know, you can see this pot with this design, you know it's from that group. This pot with a different design is probably from that group. Later, the pots get thinner walled, and they use crushed, burned marine shell as a tempering agent. They're able to go flatter so they can get thinner walls. Some of the vessels are, 30-gallon pots. They're fairly impressive. Next one. Again, right, I talked about, burial law. There are 2 burial mound groups in Fitchburg. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head which ones they are, but the burial mounds in Wisconsin, there's a place where they put ancestors. It was marking their different community groups within the larger group, and there's arguments that they were marking territories on the land. So you get 2 different types. You get the geometric, conical, and linear mounds. So you get like just a kind of a cone, and then they kind of put a couple together, and they form linear mounds. And then you get the animal and effigies. So you get the bird mounds, probably associated with the bird clan. You get the water spirit or panther mounds or bear mounds or the different types of mounds related to the other parts, the other clans within the group. And then these, like I said, these are really important. People are starting to farm, so you're trying to lay claim to the land. So somebody coming up the river doesn't say, I'm going to just claim this for myself and start a farm. There's people there. There's groups there. If you don't have a tie with that group, you probably should just keep canoeing. So I looked, and I could not find a picture of the mound groups here. So this is the Joggy site over in Verona Township. And we got a little spot here. You can show the mound. It's, they're not real obvious. Some of the mounds, as you get into out onto the plains, you get down to East St. Louis, Monk's Mound at Cahokia is 100 feet high and covers 10 acres. So that's pretty impressive.
How old is that mound?
Uh,
Right up there.
They from that time frame from about 2,500 to 800. I don't remember exactly
Yeah, but
what
that would be
Jaggy
like
dates
about
dates to.
1,700 years, you know.
Yeah. So we don't excavate mounds anymore, but early on, archaeologists did excavate mounds. There's burials in the mounds. There's cremations in the mounds. Every mound that they've ever excavated had some kind of human remains attached to it. So all of these mounds are protected under 157.
So are they sacred? Are you not supposed to walk on them? I mean, are there any kind of?
It's sacred to the people. I mean, those are important sites
Yeah.
to those people and to their culture. And I personally, if I go to a European cemetery, I try not to walk across what would be the actual shafts for the graves, but that's just me. The native groups would prefer people not, having a party on the mound, or, you see some like at Effigy Mounds National Monument. It's really nice because then we can see the outline where they've, took up the sod and put like a chalk outline around it, so you can really see them a lot better. But the groups would prefer they're left like they are.
That was bold.
Do the mounds represent individuals or family groups?
It's probably family groups, so they're usually, you can get one or two mounds, sites that just have one or two mounds. A lot of mounds were in groups, so you'd have a bunch of conicals, or like that one picture where it's a bunch of different mounds there. It's representing a bunch of different parts within that community, different clans within that community, different families within that community. Some of the mounds have burials early on, and the mound was built on top of it. Some of them have burials that were early on, mound built on top of it with later people put into the mound that were probably, again, tying back to that family group or that clan.
Does the direction of the location of the mound make a difference at all?
People have looked into that a lot, and I think there's just enough variability that it's not so much. I mean, you do get places where, like, the bird effigies are kind of more on this side, and the non-bird effigies are on this side of the site, and they're not quite as mixed up. But actual directional relationships aren't. I don't think we've got really strong data for that.
Is there equipment now, electronic equipment that you can use to see what's below?
So we. She asked if there's if we have technology now that we can see below the ground surface without impacting it, or very very minor impact. I would love to say that it's like in Jurassic Park where they shoot the shotgun shell and you can see the raptor down there or whatever. The technology doesn't quite show you that, but we do have ground penetrating radar, magnetometer, resistivity, conductivity. There's a bunch of different soil infrared. So if the soil has been moved around, it either reflects the magnetism back different, the electricity conducts through it different. Ground penetrating radar, you can see differences in structure. This one is denser, and the native stuff is denser. The non-native stuff is, or disturbed stuff is looser. So we can run machines across there. We'll get anomalies. It's not really anomalies. It's just something's there, and you would have to be able to test it. If you've done enough geophysical work, you can say something that looks like this is definitely a hearth. It's a fire ring. Something that looks like this is some kind of pit feature. The pit feature could be a storage pit. The pit feature could be a burial. There's nothing that definitively says this is a burial, unless we're in a European cemetery and we're trying to figure out where those handful of plots for burials were that weren't recorded well. We can run a ground penetrating radar across those. Those work really well on European cemeteries. So there's nothing here that we could run across and say definitively that's a burial, that's not a burial. But we do have technology that will allow us to not have to dig to get an idea of what's under the ground. So we get into the historic period. So I have a handful of slides we'll go through pretty quick at the end because it's just pictures of cool artifacts. But 1650 to the present, around the 1830s, I think it was 1838, 1839, were the first Europeans to come into what became Fitchburg. I think the first farmstead is 1838, 1839. So here's a couple of our archaeologists. I have the circle there because it's really hard to see in the picture, but the ground is like this and then it dips down. There's a depression. There's a cellar depression there from a house or some other structure. So next slide. So I pulled the cover off of the Fitchburg, a history book. One of my colleagues has a personal library that's just beyond amazing. I'm like, hey, Norm, do you have a Fitchburg book? And a day later, I get that. So I thought it's really informative. I haven't read it in depth, but if we go to the next slide. So it says the Vormans, there was a group, a family prior to the Vormans that developed a farm in Fitchburg, but they kept traveling back and forth to Madison. So they accepted these guys as the first farm. These guys lived in Fitchburg. So this is the guy, and this is his wife. She was the first white woman in Fitchburg. Next slide. And if you look here on the 1861 plat, we're looking at this area over in here. It blows up to here. There's Joseph Vorman's property. So as an archaeologist, I can tie, if I find one of the black squares are houses or structures. So if we're doing a road project, following that road that's there, and we hit a historic site that's one of those, we may be able to tie it back to the Vormans, and under the Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, National Register nomination, he could be an important person in the area, so it could be eligible just because he lived there. That was the first farm in Fitchburg. So the other one I thought was neat is we have this L.L. Adams. There's a picture there of him with his workhorses. And you look down here in section, he spans section 30 and section 29 is L.L. Adams. My circles got kind of wonky. But right under where it says L.L. Adams, you see B shop, so barber shop or bakery shop or something. We have a CH and SCH, so there's a school down there, there's a store down there, and there's some other stuff. So that's the original community of Fitchburg down here. So if we're doing a project across here, we know that there could be really important stuff here. So that's where the historic record kind of helps. So we do a lot of stuff looking at these old plat maps and trying to tie it back to people. And if we got a resource like the Fitchburg, a history, it's really nice because, we might find something to be eligible under a criteria other than D, which is research potential. So the next set of slides, most of these are from Verona Township. It's just some projects that we've done over there. So this is a sandstone and block foundation cellar for a historic house on one of the farmsteads. Next one. When we're excavating, we're looking for features. Features are dark stains, so you can see this. Where's the light at? This is your native subsoil. This is darker, it's different color. You get weird artifacts coming up in it. So we bisect it here. You can see up there, they're excavating down. So we're really controlled on what we're doing, taking photographs and everything else to figure out what it is. And then you can see up at the top, there's a crock lid. It looks like probably some kind of tin pail up at the top, maybe some glass jars, a bottle. So, it's stuff. There was a hole in the ground. Farmers are out on the farm. There's a hole in the ground. They throw the stuff in there and, level it out and farm it. So it's interesting. But I've got a bunch of slides here of just artifacts, and I'll try to be quick. And if you guys have questions, we can come up and talk. But at one of the sites, we found these little lead figurines. One of my colleagues went back and found out they're Prussian soldiers. So these are toys from the early 1900s. Next one. We got a porcelain doll head and a porcelain doll leg. I mean, I get people on the crew that get a little bit twitchy about finding doll parts, and there's always like, oh, it's just like the weird eye that's staring at me. But so we got doll parts. There's part of a harmonica soundboard, belt and suspender fasteners. So sometimes they'll have stamps on them with a patent number, or Levi Strauss and Company, or a different predecessor to that, so we can get an idea of maybe what the commodities were that people were buying and the clothing that they were using. Ink bottles, because before ballpoint pens and everything, you had your quill. So you have a stoneware one there and a glass one. Next one. A bunch of different types of tableware. We can get diagnostic maker's marks on the back or the patterning on the front. You've got your family's wheat pattern that's moved down through the generations that dates to 1840s. So we can get an idea of when the site was occupied based on the decorations that are on the ceramics or the maker's marks. We got some crocks here. Again, you got the blue, you can see the blue design on it. Local stuff, there was, what's the one up in Red Wing? Red Wing crockery and stuff. So we get a lot of Red Wing. We get a lot of Western crocks also. Next one. So you can see here's Western stoneware. It's a 15-gallon crock. And this is a couple of my colleagues doing the ultimate 3D puzzle. Where do these little pieces go? So you can see they did a really good job. They got most of the crock out of that site.
What do you use for an adhesive?
72 glue.
We use B72 acryloid, which is a plastic that's soluble in acetone. So you thin it down into a glue solution, you glue them together, but it's reversible. If you ever need to take that back apart because you find that little triangle or for whatever reason, it's removable. So you just take some acetone, rub it on there, it'll get soft, you pull it back apart, and you can clean all the B72 off. People in the past have used a bunch of different kinds of glues. They're not stable, they're not archival. Liz would, want to choke them a little bit if she could catch them. But yeah, so we use a B72 acryloid plastic glue. Some other things, we get different kinds of bottles. That's a stopper for like a wine bottle. We get wine bottles, beer bottles. You can tell what people are drinking. You can tell different medicines that they had in the past. The next one, I think, just got some more of the medicine bottles with the different embossed companies on them. And the next one is credit where credit's due. So, I think the Historical Society, where I work, Department of Transportation, all 90% of our projects through the Museum Archaeology Program are funded through Department of Transportation. My colleagues and staff, you guys, Fitchburg Historical Society, and then Liz has got the Department of Anthropology. And then just a heads up, next month is May. May is Historic Preservation and Archaeology Month. There's a QR code there. I meant to bring you guys some posters and bookmarks, but I got on the road this morning and realized I didn't have the key to the office on the way over. If you're interested in a poster or bookmark or something, maybe let Alan know. He can let me know, and we can see how many we can scrounge together. We got a handful left from last year, and then there'll be a new one this year. So the calendar currently doesn't have much on it if you follow the QR code, but if you check it later, as we get closer to March or May, we'll get a bunch of new cool posters. So I tried to make that fast and furious. So this was giving me the hurry up. I'm just there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and I wanted to talk about a lot of stuff. But that being said, I think we're done. If you guys, we have some time. If you guys want to come up and ask questions or.
I've got a question for you.
Obviously, there's a huge amount of development in Fitchburg, and much of it's private development. So outside of the burial requirement, if someone came upon a site of a burial ground, is there any obligation as, all this property is being...
If you find, she asked if you're on private land, private development, if you find burials, is that what you're asking? Or just sites?
Obviously, variables, there's...
Yeah,
if you find burials, that's a whole
Right.
process. You talk to the state archaeologist and state historic preservation office and burial sites preservation folks over there, and they will direct you where you need to go.
But if you just found something
If you find something interesting, the law is written in the United States with personal property and stuff. It'd be nice to know about, but there's no real law that protects anything for private development. But if you do find something, it would be awesome if you reached out and at least let, state archaeologists or somebody in the state come in and document what's there.
I do want to point out that a significant number of sites that we know about across the whole nation are reports from private collectors or landowners. So
Yeah.
they find something, they know about it, and they tell somebody else about it, and then we record it, and then we have a broader understanding of what happened in that area over time.
So, any other questions here at the end?
Have you completed, or are you still in process of investigating all these sites with your equipment to see what's beneath?
That is all dependent on projects. Currently, there's limited groups throughout the state that have access to those pieces of equipment. And I don't know of any, well, other than the canoes, I'm sure you guys have all heard about the canoes on Lake Mendota. They wanted to go out and use some fancy machinery over the winter, but never got enough ice on the lake to do it.
They're going to use sonar this summer,
That being said, they're working with the
Iowa.
Office of State Archaeologists in Iowa, who has like some side scanning sonar and some other kind of underwater apparatus. They're going to bring that out this summer and do some work there. But it depends on project specific needs. If it's the equipment is really expensive. Once you have it and it's paid for, it's a close to the same expense as me sending people out and they dig the holes. But
Wisconsin isn't in making a list and continuing it, where it's only that's going to be developed or something like that?
we try to record any sites. We'll put them in the database. Any projects that are that require an archaeologist to be out there. So other either federal or state projects or funded or permitted projects will have this stuff out, a project added to the map. If you have research from the university that goes out there, we'll add those projects to the map.
And the state archaeologist also has a list of priorities that she'll have. So if she gets reports of sites that she wants to follow up on, then she'll prioritize those for the coming year for her to go out and research more. But it's just her, so she can't do that many a year.
Can our 9 sites in Fitchburg be looked at, or have they been?
If someone calls in to ask for her to follow up on any of the sites, then she'll add it to our list of things to do.
Well, any project that would potentially impact any of those sites that's not just a private project and the site happens to be on private land would require investigation either under 106 or 44. The big swath of southeast Fitchburg, where there's not a lot of sites, hasn't been a lot of surveys, there's potential for quite a few sites there. It's just getting that information out. And
Does
report
anybody
it.
keep track of the big developers that are coming in the northeast section that are going?
I would love to say that archaeology's happened for some of those. I have done some surveys for some development, but it was development that was getting HUD money or money from the federal government. If it's a huge developer that comes in and they're privately funding everything, unless there's a previously recorded site there,
We can't do anything about it.
it's a tough situation. But that's all goes back to how the United States is structured with private land. In Europe, all of the archaeology, all of the cultural resources in Europe are owned by each one of those states or countries. In the United States, it's
private property.
if there's a site on your property and it's not a burial site, it's on your property.
20 years ago or so, there was an article in the paper about a boy, and I think it was the Wisconsin River, finding a huge prehistoric skull.
Yeah, it's at the Tripp Museum up in Sauk City. It was a bison antiquus, so it's essentially he found pretty much this guy, but the horns were about like this on it. So that one was kind of a neat find, and they've found a handful of bison skulls. They're on display up at the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center and at UW La Crosse. So if you go into Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center, they got a display case there with a 2 or 3 bison skulls there. Somebody else have a question?
Tom Kinney wrote a book about the history of the archaeology of Fitchburg and much of the development, and up to the 1890s or so. And he wrote about the old lead trail, which was a trail that oxen used to haul lead out of the Mineral Point area to the city of Milwaukee. And then they went to the Lake Michigan and went to fight the Civil War. And when they did that, they had all these oxen going across what turned out to be my backyard, according to Tom Kinney. And he so a friend of mine who works for the city of Fitchburg is going to come next week, theoretically, and explore with a metal detector whatever artifacts have been left behind in the since the 1840s, 1850s.
That's cool.
I think 2 trails crossed at Verona, right downtown.
Yeah.
Verona.
Well, I've done some work on a site over in Mineral Point right by Pendarvis. You got all those sucker holes out there in southwest Wisconsin. All of those were lead prospection, and early on there was enough lead in the soil. You dug a hole about this deep, and when you got whatever out of it, you dug a hole right over there and dug a hole right over there. They weren't mining going underground like they were when they got into the zinc mines later on.
For the lead?
For lead. It's interesting to note, if you look at the Wisconsin flag, those ingots on the ground, those are lead ingots. And the miner there is a lead miner. He's not a gold miner, not a iron miner. He's a lead miner. There were millions of pounds of lead coming out of Wisconsin. They were using it for ballast. They were using it for shot. They were using it for a ton of other things. It was a huge commodity industry for a long time, several decades, long time in European standards and our standards, several decades coming out of southwest Wisconsin and that kind of general area, northeast Illinois or northwest Illinois. It's just amazing how much, when you start looking at the commodities, how much lead was coming out. There's early European contact accounts of people coming into Sauk City, and they were like, the roads were paved with lead. There was just so much lead in the soil that it was like the roads were paved with lead. The Native Americans, prior to European contact, used lead as a pigment. They used hematite as a pigment. They used kaolin as a pigment to color different things. Lead would give you a green color. I don't know how safe it was to eat or drink out of those vessels, but we figured that out, when we started trying to seal cans with lead. So, but that's really cool. That'd be really interesting research. I mean, just it had to get out of there somehow. So, yeah.
Let's give Elizabeth and Luther